Thank you again for coming. We are so enthused for this summer. Please come and enjoy all of our amazing programs, and thank you for supporting the museum and our history. Please welcome Mr. Tom Klinger.
Well, thank you, Simone, and good to see you folks here today for Frisco's lectures and whatnot. And as I begin this afternoon, first to kind of get a little idea in my mind, this is the first year that they recorded these, so I've been kind of cranking through my brain to clean up my spiel that I have given in the years past and delete a couple of those vocabulary words that might be, well, anyway. So, how many of you folks have been to one of the lectures that I have given previously? If you'd raise your hands, please. Good. Okay. Next question. How many of you who are here today are year-round residences of Summit County? Okay, great. And for those of you who are visitors, a double welcome. It's not snowing today. It is great. Now, we're going to talk this afternoon about the Colorado and Southern Railroad, primarily, that originated in Denver, went from Denver over through to South Park on the other side of Hoosier Pass, came over to Breckenridge, over to Dillon, which was a little community that was in the bottom of today's reservoir, came on over to Frisco, went up the 10 Mile towards Copper Mountain, across Fremont Pass, and on to Leadville. They also had a branch that ran from the South Park out through Buena Vista, had a tunnel underneath the Collegiate Peaks, if you know where those are, and went over to the Gunnison Valley. Now, this was a narrow gauge railroad as compared to a standard gauge railroad. Narrow gauge being 3 feet between the rails versus a standard gauge railroad, which was 4 feet, 8.5 inches between rail. And on a narrow gauge, this was typically what was called a heavy rail as far as the size of the rail on the narrow gauge. This particular section is what you would see on a standard gauge railroad being used today. So you can see there was a big difference in the weight of the locomotives, the cars, and consequently the construction that took place for the railroad. Expensive, not quite as expensive, though more than one doctorate degree has been earned comparing the ratio between the earnings of the two railroads. Now, we're going to take kind of a rundown with, let me place these down back here. There's a couple other railroad pieces back there if you'd like to take a look at those as you leave. My wife is back there. It's a kind of a, wasn't planned. Between the two of us, we've ended up doing 4 books on the Colorado and Southern Railroad over a period of time. I have to remind you that Frisco was at one time a 2-railroad town. The Colorado and Southern, which was originally the Denver South Park and Pacific, as well as the Denver Rio Grande Railroad. The Colorado and Southern Railroad went a couple blocks off back over here along the side of the hill, swung around, and then went up the 10 Mile. The Rio Grande Railroad ran over here across on the other side of the street, also went up the 10 Mile. The Rio Grande terminated in Dillon. The Denver South Park and Pacific swung around at Dillon, went up to where today's Keystone Ski Resort is. Now, to get started this morning as I was eating breakfast, I jotted down some terminology that'll run by you, and I'll try to relate to some of these terms during my presentation today. And it goes something like this. Now, don't feel bad if you do not understand what in the world I am talking about. And I ran this past our grandkids this morning at breakfast over here in the South Park, and oh my gosh, Granddad, what in the world are you doing? Well, anyway, it goes like this. At Como, I had a 4 a.m. call for milepost 122. We were bucking snow with a butterfly and snowbirds when we had to join the birds. We died on the law and then used a dead man to get the engine on the track. The brakie tied the train down, and after going to the barn, we tied up and went to beans. I had enough on the High Line and pulled the pin and rode the cushions to Frisco. Okay, now, I'm sure you all have understood exactly what I have related, and with that we will go on and see what we can come up with some slides. And it is quite possible that I will maybe have missed some of these terms, and if I do, please kind of snag on the conversation as we go on later on. And in April of 1937, the last train went through Frisco, and by the summer of 1938, along about this time of the summer of 1938, the scrapping trains worked their way down the canyon from the Copper Mountain area and through Frisco and up through Breckenridge. A number of these items came from an engineer who carried a camera with him by the name of A.A. Anderson. This was a pass that was issued to A.A. Anderson for his family for free passage on the railroad. I might mention, you notice it says daughter Gertrude, and we were fortunate to go to a birthday party of hers a number of weeks ago, and she is 98 now. But anyway, let's get on with the railroad business. And this is a picture of the eastbound passenger train consistent of a locomotive, mail and baggage car, and a coach at the rear end, which was typical in the latter years of the railroad. This photograph was taken at the Breckenridge Depot, which was located where the tramway parking lot is that comes down into Breckenridge today. This particular photograph of engine number 9 was taken in Dillon, and as I mentioned, the Dillon that you see today is a relocated town. Actually, I believe it is the third relocation for Dillon over the years. This is A.A. Brownie Anderson on his locomotive at a railroad junction of Dickey. Dickey was located at the bottom of Dillon Reservoir, a short distance where the traffic light is, where that construction is underway at the present time as you come from Breckenridge headed towards Frisco. Wintertime. Again, this is a photo at Dickey with a rotary snow plow right here, followed by 2 locomotives, and typically at least 2, if not 3 locomotives were used to push this rotary snowplow. The rotary snowplow had a large wheel here in the front like a fan that would revolve. Inside this housing of the rotary snowplow was a full-size steam locomotive that was used solely to power this wheel. This was not a self-propelled machine. It had to be pushed by those locomotives. You can see that in this particular incident, Dickie was kind of cool with all of that ice that has accumulated along the side of the tank. And over here on the top of the car, and that's a bedroll right there, these are snowbirds. And they are basically day laborers that were hired to shovel snow. If the rotary got stuck or the locomotive was derailed, they would shovel snow to open up the railroad. Again, you can see a lot of bedding up there on the top of the caboose. It's a little hard to see because of the light here, but this white spot here is the chef. This was meals would be served for the employees who were working on the railroad. In 1936, there was a very heavy snowstorms in the Summit County area. The Colorado and Southern Railroad operated 2 different rotaries. And you can see the difference in the pattern of the fans that were used for plowing the snow. And as these fans would go around, the snow would fly out by centrifugal force off of this chute and would go over here, anywhere from 150 to 300 feet. You can notice that these blades are bent. If you would hit a tree from an avalanche or some rocks that came down with an avalanche, it just raised all kinds of heck with the machinery. Here's a close-up of the fan of these blades. This particular rotary was built for standard gauge operation, and they were able to lift it off of the standard gauge trucks, wheels that is, and put it on a 3-foot set of wheels to use on the High Line. The High Line was a term that was used for the railroad as it ran from Como across Boreas Pass to Breckenridge, Dillon, Frisco, and on to Leadville. Here you can see some of the implements from the, I forget what you called them now. What did we say they were? Snowbirds. Yes, there you go. And this is undoubtedly a railroad official here. And a rotary snowplow has stopped here at an avalanche. And this would be at about milepost 122 in 10 Mile Canyon. The 10 Mile Canyon area was extremely prone to avalanches. If any of you have ridden a bike or hiked that particular area, those mountains along the side there were very prone to losing their snow and sliding down. There's a series of photographs that were taken in the spring that kind of match up to some of the black and white photos that were taken in the days that the railroad was in operation. Here you see the official. What is taking place here, you see a coil of wire here. It's you can't tell it at this point here, but the wires went up and were connected onto the telegraph wires on the pole, and he could telegraph the dispatchers along the line, either in Leadville or in Denver, and let them know what the status was as they are plowing in the area of the avalanche. Over here on the side, there's a couple snowbirds observing the rotary as it is working through this avalanche. It's throwing the snow off over this direction towards the left. The snowbirds would have to dig some pilot holes looking for rocks and trees that came down in an avalanche. You just can't talk enough about the number of avalanches and the depth of these snowslides and the problems which they caused for the railroad. And again, another view, here's the locomotive kind of buried in snow, and the rotary is working away. There had been deaths that occurred in those avalanches over there, that as the machinery was working away, plowing up along 10 Mile, the noise and vibrations would send an avalanche down and destroy the equipment. A. Brownie Anderson, an engineer on the locomotives, as I mentioned, would carry a camera with him, and when the train would be stopped because of some stones or trees, he would hop out of the cab and walk over and snap a picture of what is taking place. Here you can see the depth of this particular avalanche that had come down across here. And in this particular view, he has taken a picture out across the locomotives that are pushing the rotary up the 10 Mile Canyon. Typically, the rotary was kept in Como, and when there is a slide, they would come on down and across Boreas Pass, through Breckenridge down to Dickey, get coal, get water, and proceed to the area of milepost 122 was a very prevalent area for slides. And again, you can see where the height of that avalanche. And this distance that's above that rotary would have to be shoveled down. These trees standing up here, that's another story. We'll try to get to that. Here's a case where Anderson has stepped off of his locomotive. He is looking up towards Copper Mountain ski area. It'd be got back over there a couple miles. There you can see debris from trees that got shredded as they came down the slopes over here in an avalanche. And here's a view that he has taken looking back alongside the train. This is a power shovel that in 1936 was borrowed from Summit County to help in digging out this slide. It was a monstrous. There is a passenger coach in the back. And again, another view of the locomotives pushing the rotary up through 10 Mile Canyon. This is an interesting view. Anderson had gotten off his locomotive, walked out across the debris field from the avalanche. You can see some good-sized logs along the way. And these are things that would have come down and would have had to have been moved by hand. And that's where the snowbirds came in. They had to dig that out. And here you see a group of men. They are at the face. The rotary had gone up that far. It had stopped. And at this point, they are looking for some trees and rocks. You can see the power shovel. You have to keep in mind that when these slides came down, this snow was like concrete. It wasn't a deal that you would sink into it. It was packed, so you can imagine we had this steam shovel up here sitting on top of the snow. Here you can see the guys are digging away, looking for trees and rocks that have come down here before the rotary comes down. You can see a portion of a telephone pole sticking up. And again, you see these sticks over here. And again, as I said, that'll come up in the story later on. Here's the face. That's as far as the rotary has gone. You see some tree branches here. And the snowbirds are digging away. These here in the front will shovel on the face and push this snow down here on the track so that when the rotary will come up against that, it can throw that snow off over here towards the creek. And again, you can see the debris. Here's a log going across. And these guys are digging away looking for more trees. Here's a picture of the power shovel. And while compared to today's sizes, it is quite small, but considering this trackless vehicle could run across the top of the snow, give you an idea of how hard that is packed down. And again, you see these sticks in there. That was there for basically two purposes. One,
You need to be this way, you're in the picture.
oh, okay, I won't say anything. Should have hollered. The way the rotary operated, they would have a man in this cab of the rotary which would operate the rotary, regulate how fast around that wheel is going. You would have a man in the cab also that would be yelling as to what obstructions are coming up. There would be in the back of the rotary, which would be over here someplace, a fireman to stoke the boilers. So with these sticks, the pilot of the rotary would have an idea of where the tracks are. Now notice this triangular splotch up here on the side of the mountain. There it is today. So if you go hiking up there or bicycle riding, and you look up there on the side of the mountain, you can see that. Interstate 70 is over here behind those trees along the side of the mountain over there. The Denver Rio Grande Railroad ran approximately where the interstate highway does today. Another, another view of the face. The story here is a rotary had gone through, opened up the railroad, and they no sooner got it opened up and a secondary slide came down. And they had to go back and redo it. And here's a view of the same location in a nice warm day in March. And again, in the springtime, that's when the rotaries were used to a great extent. And when the avalanches would really run. Here's an idea of what the face would look like, where the rotary ran down here. The man down here has a pick, and he's digging out a log that's down here that has to come out. These men are shoveling away, and since this snow would be packed so hard, they would loosen it with dynamite. Here's a passenger coach. Again, the lighting conditions are such here that you cannot see, but over here on the side, they have unloaded the express from the baggage car. It will be carried across the avalanche to the other side, where a train would have backed down from Leadville. And again, give you an idea of the depth of this avalanche. You may be able to tell over here on the side, those are steps that were dug into the avalanche. See, it came down across here like this. And that was for passengers and for the people who were carrying the express crawl up over the top of the avalanche, down around to the other side before the road was opened. And notice the hills here in the background. And there's those same hills as they appear at the present time. Now, one of the problems and hazards that they had that fell to the snowbirds is once in a while those charges, you might be able to see a stick back here, failed to go off. So somebody had to get out there, dig down, find that charge that was unexploded dynamite. Here again, if you can get the idea of the size of this slide, gentleman here is peeking over the edge, kind of watching to see that there's not a tree sticking in down there. And you can see the logs sticking out of here. So it was a horrendous job to keep this railroad open. This is looking up towards Copper Mountain, you're about a mile and a half downstream from Copper Mountain. You can't see in this photograph, engineer is leaning out of the window with his heavy sunglasses to prevent snow blindness from operating in the bright snow. After the line was opened up and plowed open, the trains would stop at a water tank at Solitude, sometimes called Wheeler, and this particular location is across Highway 24 from the entrance to Copper Mountain ski area. These two locomotives have stopped at the water tank to take water. This view was taken in July of 1937 after the railroad was closed. They sent two locomotives from Leadville to Breckenridge to pick up all of the cars that were on sidings along the way. These two engines are on their way going back to Leadville. Here's another view. You can see some water streaming down from the water tank of them taking water at Solitude. By 1941, there is the water tank at Solitude. The rails are gone. Copper Mountain ski area in later years is over here about where the edge of the piano is. Frisco is on down the 10 Mile Canyon area. In the wintertime, that is what it looks like today. If you have a sharp eye, you know the area well. Here is Interstate 70 over here as you are coming up to the Copper Mountain exit and also the exit on down to Leadville. In the fall of the year, it's a great time to visit. For those of you who are out of the area, you might want to consider about the 20th or so of September. The aspen turn brilliant yellow, and here is how the railroad, which is now a bike path and hiking path, appears in the fall of the year. This is I simply turned around in the opposite direction. Copper Mountain is over here. Took this view looking upgrade where the railroad had been at one time. When I took this particular view, I noticed, you can't see it on this slide, so don't attempt to see it, but I noticed up here there was a white spot. And I thought, well, my gosh, I don't recall hearing about a plane crashing into one of the mountains in 10 Mile Canyon. And as I walked on up a little bit further and I looked up, I noticed the white spot had moved. Well, as old as I am, I figured I was just seeing things. And a little bit later, white spot had moved again. Anybody have any ideas what? Right, a mountain goat. Wintertime view, or I should say springtime. And one of the things that you do have to be careful if you're cross-country skiing in a 10-mile area in the wintertime is you want to be sure that you're not in an avalanche run as you go up the 10-mile. Now, after the railroad was abandoned, April 1937, the last train went through town. There's a little bit of a side story that, well, let's see if I can sharpen that. I guess I can't. A little bit of a side story. The Como over in the South Park was a railroad town, And of course, when the railroad was abandoned, why, so went the employment, and people just packed up and left, or just flat left and didn't even pack up. Well, a bunch of the young people in Como, in an effort to have something to do, rounded up, these were 18 and 20-year-olds, rounded up an old Model T. They got a set of railroad wheels, put those on the T, and they traversed from Como across Boreas Pass to Breckenridge, down through Frisco, over as far as, this was the depot at Kokomo. And Kokomo now is right at the edge of the big tailings ponds from the Climax mine. They also went across the South Park, across Kenosha Pass, to the headwaters of the Platte Canyon. Those of you who do not frequent this area in the wintertime, this is what you might see on the highway. This is a modern snow blower that's used by the Colorado Department of Highways to clear snow off the highways in this area. But anyway, going back to these kids, they ran all over the area, went over to Fairplay, and come Saturday evening they would get things going, and they'd load up a couple of the girls in Como, and they would go to Breckenridge to party. And I was fortunate enough on our first book to interview one of the fellows who was involved in all of this shenanigans. And that really produces a whole different story. Now, at the time that the railroad was operating, messages would be delivered to the engine crew by paper. Keep in mind, there was not such a thing as a cell phone type thing for communicating. So messages were given to the train crew. This is difficult to read, but it says that we have two engines, engine 162, 156, will wait at Curtin. Curtin was a siding that's over close to milepost 122 in 10 Mile Canyon. So this train had to wait on a siding for a train that was coming from Leadville. And this paperwork was on a tissue-thin piece of paper so that many carbon copies could be produced for different members of the train crew. Today, occasionally, in the southern part of Colorado, on the tourist railroad of the Cumbries and Toltec, they will at times use a rotary snowplow in mid-May to open that railroad for their tourist traffic come Memorial Day. So these machines are still used. They are still used on standard gauge railroads across Wyoming, Nebraska, and Kansas. They're primarily used in wind-swept areas. And with that, we are going to conclude here with the sunrise view. Now, this railroad, after it was abandoned and scrapped, that was kind of the end of the road. And then in recent times, as those of you who are not residents, and lots of visitors started coming to this area, there's an interest in what's that swath going down there? What's that dirt road that goes across Boreas Pass? And some of the communities then have kind of embraced the idea of their history and the railroads that went through this area. Typically at Frisco, if my memory will work for me here, I think it was about 11:15 in the morning. The train from Leadville would come through here. You would catch that train, and you would be in Denver by about 5, 6 o'clock in the evening. If it was not a heavy snowstorm, if they didn't have to use a dead man. Oh, we didn't talk about dead men, did we? Anybody know what a dead man? Well, that's the wrong question. I made the error probably at one of my early talks here in Frisco. And I go rattling on and I talk about the dead men and all of this. And there was a couple people that were sitting there were getting a little, geez, what's this guy talking about? Well, anyway, a dead man is a large beam or a log which is buried in the ground with a cable around it. It acts like an anchor. So let's say over here we have a locomotive that's lying on its side. We'll go over here and we'll bury a dead man. And that was hand labor. Pick and shovel, whether it is 70 degrees outside or so many degrees below zero. And the frost line in these mountains can be down as far as 6, 8 feet. They had to bury this anchor. They would run that cable over to this locomotive. And from that locomotive, with a pulley, they'd run a cable back over to a locomotive that was on the tracks. Then as the engine that's on the tracks would back up and would pull with this anchor, the anchor stays in place, and as it pulls, whoa, gesundheit. One of two things is going to happen. The cable might snap, and when I say cable, talking about a hemp rope. A hemp rope. Or the locomotive would come over and be righted. Now, it may not be on the tracks yet, but they've gotten the locomotive righted. So that term is where the dead man phrase comes into use. And the people that were the laborers, the mechanical people for taking care of derailments on the Colorado and Southern Railroad were very apt, very proficient at re-railing a locomotive by basically brute force. And one of the stories that circulates that took place down in the east of Kenosha Pass was a locomotive rolled over on its top in the river, and the wrecking crew came out of Como and came down, and the officials came up from Denver to see this wreck, and the officials observed, yes, locomotive's upside down, it's in the middle of the river, and they went on up the way to a resort area to have some food, and the story, of course, may be stretched, but by the time the officials came back, locomotive is sitting up right side up. But anyway, have another item to show to you. Prior to 1900, 1905, railroad cars were hooked together with a link and a pin. Today, they use what is called a knuckle coupler, which is pretty much like your hand. And like your hand, they go together and couple together. Now, with the link and the pin, the brakeman, to couple a car, had to kind of stand in such a way that he could see the engineer up there, night or day, rain or shine, and signal to the engineer and step between the cars and put this in a slot, get the engineer to back up, and put the pin in. And if you are observant, and I came across a couple when I was working on these 4 books that my wife and I did, you will see a photograph of a brakeman standing around like this. Yes. And again, I made the mistake on that analogy with a bunch of 6th graders. And they saw my fingers. And my recovery was, well, I was a math teacher, and that's how I taught fractions. Now, so then I made the comment about pulling the pin. And that's what we're referring to. You pull the pin. It's a term that is used by people today, and maybe you might be in the occupation such that when you have retired, the phrase is, I've pulled the pin. You've quit. And that's where that comes from. Now, questions? Yes, sir.
Were the rotary and the locomotive manufactured at the same time, or were they 2 separate units put together? And who did the manufacturing of those?
Holy cats. There were a number of manufacturers of locomotives. There were a number of manufacturers of rotary snowplows. Cook Locomotive Works was one of the manufacturers of rotary snowplows. Llama was a manufacturer of rotary snowplows as well as locomotives. So it was a how do I want to say that? The locomotive that was in a rotary snowplow was a type of boiler and type of mechanism that was used in a Shay locomotive, if you know what a Shay locomotive was. Because the problem with a rotary snowplow, on an ordinary steam engine, you want to be able to do something like this, to have the pistons produce power such as this to turn your wheels as you go down the track. With a rotary snowplow, you're not interested in this, you're interested in this. And the design that was used for a Shay locomotive fit that bill a little bit closer. Now, in the front of a rotary snowplow, where the pilot and engineer of the rotary stood, underneath of their feet was a huge bevel set of gears that would change the rotation on a back and forth motion to a rotary motion. The beveled gears were set at a 90-degree angle. The bevels were cut at 45 degrees. And that is what would then give them that rotation. Now, it is strange that we are now, we're 80 years since the railroad operated, and it is strange what does come to light in recent times. About 3 weeks ago, I was given some correspondence that dealt with a family from east central Nebraska who were well-to-do, very well-to-do, and made some heavy investments over here in the 10 Mile Canyon area in the mining district. And in reading through this correspondence, I thought, wow, that's strange. I wonder if there's anything in a newspaper. And for those of you who have a little bent for history, I suggest that you look on the internet to the Colorado Historic Newspaper site. And they have digitized many of the newspapers of the smaller communities in Colorado. And I did that. And by gosh, I found a newspaper article about this family on their tour of the mine and the meeting of the directors of this mining company and the money that they lost. And also photograph albums come to light, which is amazing, some of the things that take place. Another question. Yes, ma'am.
How did they keep the water towers from freezing? And then if it avalanched behind the snowplow, how did they get it back there to?
That's where the snowbird came in.
They just shoveled it?
And at times, and that happened in 1936, if you recall, I had a photograph of two rotaries sitting side by side. That was kind of the backup. And in heavy-duty snowplow work, they would have the rotary. They would have 2, 3, 4 locomotives. And most of the time, the last locomotive in that lineup would be turned around backwards, so that as they went forward and they stalled or got stuck, or if there was a small slide, they could back up. And that locomotive would have what was called, I missed that term, the butterfly snowplow, which was simply a wedge-shaped snowplow. And they could push, 5, 6, 7 feet of snow or so. And you'll see some old photographs, perhaps, that locomotive has hit the snow bank, especially if it's not an avalanche, just fluffy snow, and the whole locomotive is covered in snow, from the smokestack to the bottom, completely covered with snow. And in today's world, with a diesel locomotive, it is not uncommon when that train crew gets to their terminal after a blizzard in the plains that somebody has to get there with a shovel and dig the doors out so they can get out of the locomotive. Yes, ma'am.
Was there any train derailment over Boris Pass, and was there any deaths on that?
Yes, yes, and yes.
How many?
How many? I don't know, but I like to poke around and see what I can find. And I've walked and poked around on Boreas Pass over the years, and that's more than 2 years. And my conclusion is that if there is a straightaway and if there is a curve, there was a wreck. And that's where joining the birds comes in. And if you happen to drive over Boreas Pass between Breckenridge and Como, my comments are to try to set your speed at about 10 to 15 miles an hour. Have your windows down. Have your head out the window. And you're on a steam engine going over Boreas Pass. And why did they have these accidents? Brake failure was one. Occasionally there would be an error by the conductor in calculating the weight of the load that the train is pulling. And the more mass you have, if you recall in high school physics, give you an idea about how much force you're going to have going down the mountain. And those errors are being made today. About 10 years ago, they had a disaster in California. They made an error in calculating how much of a load they had. They didn't have the braking power to stop it. There was no way. As soon as they went over the top of the hill, case was closed. And so that was very common. The last major accident that occurred in Boreas Pass was in January of 1936. And that, if you need to leave, I go right ahead and I'll kind of wrap up maybe with this story. We'll see what happens. But anyway, this train crew had originated in Leadville. They had 2 locomotives. They had stopped in at the top of Fremont Pass at the Climax Mine, picked up some more cars. They left Leadville around 8:30 in the morning, came down through Frisco, went on over out here where the new construction is taking place on the highway towards Breckenridge, went down into the bottom of where Dillon Reservoir is right now, took water, coal, and headed for Como. By the time they came down 10 Mile Canyon, they were in a first-class Summit County roaring snowstorm. I remember they left at about 8 o'clock in the morning. They got over to Breckenridge. They had picked up an extra locomotive at Dickey. So they now had 3 locomotives. And I'm not sure on the cars, I believe it was 10 or 11 freight cars that were loaded. They stopped in Breckenridge to take some water. And by that time, it was approximately 9 o'clock in the evening. So you can do a little mental calculation. What in the world is going on? Now, backing up a little bit. In 1936, a railroad crew was by law permitted to work 16 hours. And if 16 hours came up, they would die on the law. That was a railroad operating rule. And at Breckenridge, they concluded they had approximately 20 miles to go from Breckenridge to Como. Okay? 16 hours they are allowed to work. Do your clock arithmetic. Left Leadville at 8 in the morning. 16 hours. They figured no problem. Off they go. They got over to at Baker Water Tank, if any of you have driven over the pass, and they stalled. They couldn't, with 3 locomotives, pull their train. So they cut, that means they uncoupled, the locomotives, and they took about 4 cars and headed for the top of Boreas Pass. They didn't make it. So they backed down and they left the 4 cars. The 3 locomotives went up. They got it plowed to the top of the pass. And the clock is tick, 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 16 hours. They got the rest of the train. They got up to the top of the pass. Now, at the top of the pass, they are at their 16 hours. Have any of you driven over Boreas Pass? Okay. There's a section house up there. If you happen to be in the area on August the 18th, there's some guy going to give a historical talk up there. That's me. Well, anyway, they got their train together, and they took 2 engines that were on the front, unhooked those, and those two engines headed for Como, which is pretty much standard operation in the mountains, that if you have a bunch of engines on the front of the train, you try to go down the mountain with only two, so that if there is a derailment, you don't lose everything. Well, anyway, the section house on the top of Boreas Pass was closed, was abandoned. There was no food there. It's the middle of winter. A roaring blizzard's on the go. And they elected to make an illegal run to Como, which was not unheard of. Two locomotives got about 2 miles down from the top of Boreas Pass, and unbeknownst to the train crew, they didn't get one of those flimsy train orders, the passenger train from Denver had come out of Como, going up the mountain, and it stalled. It backed to Como. So the two locomotives are coming down the mountain, and unbeknownst now, there's a ground blizzard, it's snowing. You have a little headlight, it's probably plastered with snow, and there's this huge mound of snow and ice in the tracks. And they hit that, and down the mountain they go. Engineer in the lead engine was killed. The other crew members were not. The engines became uncoupled, and the one engine that the man was killed in had rolled over, so he was crushed. The other locomotive stayed on its wheels and went down the mountain, probably, 3 football lengths, into the trees, and slowly laid over. These guys got out, and they knew the procedure was about 15 minutes after they left the top, the other engine with the train would follow. Yes. So they crawled through the snow, got up to the tracks with their handy-dandy kerosene lanterns, and they did stop that train. It took that winter about a month to re-rail the locomotive that rolled over. The one that went way down the mountain stayed there till late that summer when they retrieved it. And that was the last major wreck on Boreas Pass. But again, at just about every curve, and I poked around, I thought, there's a straightaway, they could pick up speed, there's a curve, there's probably a wreck. And you find the debris, the broken glass, the coal, pieces of iron, and did find a penny at one of them from Austria. Late 1890s. You figure that one out. I don't know. But anyway, that was the big derailment of Boreas Pass. I told that story on the top of Boreas Pass about, must have been about 8, 9 years ago. And two ladies raised their hand. That was our daddy that rode that train down. You never know what you're going to find out. And if your folks work on the railroad, nobody? You never know.